I'm an arranger of visual elements. That's what I do. I have horror vacui. I'm just frightened to death of a space that has nothing going on. I got to do something. And there's just something nice. And shaping these big, thick pieces. It's just nice to have this halo and everything, and all of a sudden, to me, right now, the purpose of art is to create wonder.
Harold Balazs does create wonder. A prolific artist and craftsman, Harold has mastered an incredible range of media, from enameled steel to cast concrete, from watercolor to all types of metal, from cloth to wood. Harold does it all. His finished pieces include massive architecturally integrated sculptures in both concrete and brick, and numerous public art commissions in a variety of media.
He sees the humor and the seriousness of purpose within each project. And I think that's the beautiful meld of a Harold Balazs.
We used to call him the wild man.
Bigger than life.
Magic.
Playfulness.
Giving, always more than 100%. I'd say 110 at least.
Artisanship.
A mentor of all mentors.
Here's a fellow who's unbridled. He's just loose as can be, and yet he was disciplined. So how do you combine those two? Harold Balazs.
Born in rural Westlake, Ohio in 1928, Harold Balazs grew up on a farm during the Great Depression.
I still have this crazy hang-up from the Depression that I grew up in with my parents, and that material resources are more valuable than human resources. Yeah. The Depression is just such a funny thing on my life, because when I built that boat, I saved odds and ends of wood. Well, finally, after 20 years, I took all these little scraps of oak and everything, and I got all of these picture frames made out of scraps left over from building my boat. It makes me feel so good. I didn't have to waste it.
Harold's teenage years were spent in many pursuits, including working in his father's sheet metal and air conditioning business. His interest in art was sparked at the age of 13, and though he started out in aeronautical engineering at Wright Junior College in Chicago, Harold eventually ended up as an art major at Washington State University in Pullman.
The time I went to school was formalism, so you learn formalist ideas about composition and construction and what art was, but there was never any indication that you could possibly make a living at this.
He's one of the few artists in Washington who has supported themselves on their work.
I started making costume jewelry, enamel on copper stuff. Mostly we were making little earrings that we enameled on pennies, because we didn't have copper to speak of. And so I had actually lined up a little store, one in Portland, one in Seattle, and one in Spokane, that sold some of that trinketry while we were still in school. And then I was so naive in 1951 that I just assumed I would be able to make a living as a self-employed person.
It was during those days that Harold met and married his wife, Rosemary. They settled in Meade, Washington, outside of Spokane, and started a family.
I could never have done this without Rosemary. I mean, it's just, she stood by me through thick and thin, and plus just plain physical labor she gave to the cause.
Now that he has arthritis and, you know, his arms hurt or whatever, I can run the grinders and still do that better than he can in a lot of ways.
It's one thing to have a vision, and it's quite another to share a vision that might not necessarily be your own.
Harold is vocal, and it's very hard to compete with that. So I've always kind of been the one in the background.
I don't think Dad could have done it without the support of Mom, and not just getting down in the mud with him, but being there in the tough times and, you know, taking care of the kids and doing all of those things she did. She was It's certainly vitally important to his success.
After we had 3 children, I didn't work outside the home, and we just got by. Someone always saved us. We had one good friend who used to make bread and put coins in it.
Without a doubt, there were lean years, and yet he was such a committed artist, committed to what he was doing, that he developed a style of working that permitted his support of his family and his remaining here in Spokane.
One of the reasons I've been able to survive is I find if I can do all aspects, and there's a lot of metal sculptors who have somebody else do their casting or somebody else do their fabrication, and generally speaking, those people require, because of other factors, twice the hourly wage that I really feel I need to survive. So I say, well, why in the hell not figure out how to do it and do it yourself and get that money?
A technical innovator with a background in construction, Harold Balazs embraced new materials with a zeal. His use of styrofoam in concrete relief casting and sculpture caused a revolution of possibility for both sculptors and architects.
When styrofoam come along, because I worked in construction, like if you're going to make a flight of stairs out of concrete, you don't make a flight of stairs first and then make a mold off it and pour concrete. You make the space around what you want the stairs to be and pour concrete in that. So you skip that step, which is the most tedious. So styrofoam made it possible to make a mold, albeit one of a kind, which most of my architecture work was. So you could just generate a surface or volume, depending on your cleverness, out of this material. I use a lot of styrofoam, so by carving, shaping, forming it, and putting it in the forms before the wall was poured, enabled you to get this marvelous decorative surface on or whatever kind of a surface, on a large space for, $1 a square foot maybe, instead of doing something quite elaborate and then stucking it on the wall. This is the old double-sawed bandsaw thing. I sawed this way, and then I rotated each piece and sawed it that way. The forms are out here, and the styrofoam was nailed on from this way, and you can see the remnants of what they call the tie-toos that held the forms together while the concrete was poured in.
The first time we worked with him, we invited him to look at our project, and he says, yes, I like to get in on a project early. I don't like to have my work just applied to the wall like a cosmetic thing. He wants his projects to be integral with the architecture.
So I started working with architects in a way that enabled me to make the wall, or come up with how the wall was created.
He connected with the young architects in town, and so any embellishments or anything that they needed done on their buildings, he worked with them. And he always assumed he could do anything. So if it was concrete, of course he could do concrete, even if he had never done it. And he just said, sure, I can do that, and came home and did it.
He was perhaps the most easy person to get along with. He just seemed to be part architect. He understood what the architect was after.
They just sort of took it upon themselves to mention to the client that they had this clever craftsman that we could do a little jazzy something here, and could you spare 500? Could you spare 2,000 or whatever? And so oftentimes I was just written right into the construction budget.
I always wondered if Harold shouldn't have become an architect. I think had he become one, he would have put out work very similar to Frank Gehry's, even better.
Many of Harold's architectural commissions were for churches and synagogues. The mediums always varied, but the bold lines of a Harold Balazs piece of art remain constant.
Harold would do a great deal of research on anything that related to a commission, and in the church he found religions to be very interesting. The line is a very forceful, powerful line, and he captures the essence of any shape with a line.
Harold's work with architects earned him the prestigious National Craftsmanship Medal from the American Institute of Architects in 1966. The St. Charles Borromeo church doors are an exquisite example of Harold's unique enameling technique.
This material is what they call vitreous enamel, and it's essentially just colored glass that has been ground to a consistency, and you can buy it at various formulations depending upon the way you use it. It has a million ways of being used, and this is one that I find. And I have this nervous finger, which makes it easy to go pity-pat and all of that. So this is my technique. The other nice thing about this material, it's not like ceramic glazes. What you see is what you get. The stencil is mylar. I used to make them out of heavy paper. I use a frosted mylar so I can actually draw on it. And my children and wife and everybody used to participate in the stencil cutting process.
In the early 1980s, Harold was one of a handful of artists allowed by Pioneer Porcelain Enamel in Seattle to work in their shop on larger-scale projects.
And he came in with these large paper stencils, and they were probably maybe about 4 feet by 4 feet, and they looked like doilies. And then he would take these colored powders in salt and pepper shakers, and he would shake them on and take these little brushes and go around these outlines that he'd made and kind of sweep these things back in. And in this really dusty, kind of dirty environment that was very industrial, Harold would come in, and all of a sudden the colors would kind of splash out on the walls, and it was a pretty amazing thing.
The colors are opaque, transparent, and opalescent. Sort of like working with transparent watercolor and gouache, where you just layer these things.
He's one of the few artists that I know who are using the jewelry enamels, simply because when you fire the jewelry enamels, you have to fire them horizontally. So you can only fire them one panel at a time, and very carefully, because if you jiggle, it's gone.
All of his equipment in his shop is something that he has built to his needs. So these enamel firing ovens that he's created were built by himself to accommodate these large panels.
And I want to welcome you to our celebration of the reinstallation of rhododendrons by noted Northwest artist Harold Balazs. All of the work that was in the Kingdom is now being recited.
Trying to put art in the Kingdom is sticking a postage stamp on it. You know, it's such a monstrous thing. So it was just like buying a painting you like and hanging it in your house is really what decorating the Kingdom was about.
It's very exciting for the public art program to see these works live on. There's something wonderful about seeing a splash of color on a building that isn't a billboard. No text, no advertisement, just pure art. It's really a wonderful addition to the streetscape of 4th Avenue.
As an urban planner, to me, art is important as an element of a city, but also I think more than that, I think it's an element of culture, and so it should be, shared in the public art, and particularly with Harold's work. He's done some really great public art, and I think the one thing he does, he's able to create pieces that, in some cases, abstractions that people can relate to.
Harold's place in public art has to do with doing a lot with a little. The public art budgets are very often very small. Harold was able to create large, durable artwork with, a very small budget. I've known Harold to say, "I can give you some back," and all the artists are going, "Harold, no!" I think that, the arts commissions realize that Harold will do a really smashing job and not go over budget.
I think the hardest aspect of any of these public art things is how the beginner gets into it. Selection is based on resume, essentially, and I've always opposed resumes because that means I'm always being chosen for what I've been, not for what I can become.
Harold not only created public art, he also served 3 times as a Washington State Arts Commissioner.
I think so many in the public art arena want to make great art, and I see a lot of times all that's necessary is just a nice little carved brick pattern around the door. Maybe that'll do the job. Years ago, I did a piece up at the Tubby Graves building. There was an old gentleman. He was a laborer cleaning up, and obviously had no art training. And he watched me. He says, he says, I look at that, and he says, I don't know what that is, but he says, that's not important. He says, what's really important is that I can find this thing on this huge building that I know somebody did with their hands and cared about. And he says, what's more important than that is that the administration of this college has found it necessary to do those things. And that is the most profound argument for public art I've ever heard.
He gets up in the morning and he starts on our dead run, doing stuff that's all productive, making all in the name of art, with a small a. It's really important to him that it's not art with a capital A, art with a small a, which means that it's for everybody.
Because I've never taught and I don't have another means of employment, I've got to produce something that I can sell.
He worked with glass, he worked with rock, he worked with clay, with wood, paper. Whatever he touched, it became a piece of art, and it was recognizable Balazs, just like a piece of Beethoven composition. And that's the special thing about Harold. His art was sincere, his art was original.
It still starts out pencil and paper. To me, drawing is still the quintessential element in visual art.
He has the facility to do something fast, quickly, and make it fresh. It's crisp in line and form and outline. It's not labored over.
Three-dimensional work, I'll just actually go to the bandsaw with a block of styrofoam, because that lends itself as a way of sketching rather than pencil, sketching in 3 dimensions, as it were.
I think his main interest in life is creating images. His nervousness about selling work is not only a pragmatic issue, but also it helps him justify making more. He wants to sell his images so he can make more images.
I know we'd be trying to fill out an order for, say, earrings or something, and I'm in there, cutting them all out and doing this other thing. He's already designing the next line,
The speed with which he works is half of what he would like to be working with. He is so full of ideas and directions to go as an outgrowth of his previous work that I think sometimes he's frustrated most about doing artwork because he can't work faster.
These are things that go bump in the night. They're my answer to the fact that most artists have always done grotesques, and I've been scolded by serious people for doing such frivolous things when I'm such a great artist and should be devoting my energies to more serious matters. I acquired my tools in order of preference that would do the most things for me. Like the first thing I did was buy an acetylene torch, because that enabled me to weld and heat things and do the enameling.
Harold is the Renaissance man. He invents techniques. If he wants to achieve a certain look and it's never been done before, and there's no book that you can go back to figure out how to do that, he'll create it himself.
I happen to be working on these doors for a private home, and this is a rather large one, and it's going to be repressed copper. This, one of the ways I work is just to hammer, create a form and hammer into it, and then create a little extra stuff by extra hammering. And I never learned this. I just started doing it.
He always says he's a craftsman. And when I look at his work, I see the artist who knows his craft.
I try to keep sound craftsmanship part of what I do.
He understood his material. He knew what the thing he was using did. He didn't try to make it do something else.
Harold is so energetic and productive. My work, being so tight in some respects, is slower. And so one of the banes of our collaboration is he's got it done, he's on to the 3rd or 4th piece, and I'm still trying to finish the first one. We did a collaborative piece for a school in Alaska. It was 14 sculptures for a sculpture garden. I did 2 of them, and he did the other 12. In one project, he said, let's do this proposal. It was going to be a war canoe, a Haida war canoe. And so he said, well, let's look at this as the water line. And anything above that you just deal with, and anything below it I'll deal with. And so we took our 2 halves of paper home and we did these drawings and put them together. And his was a great reflection in his very abstract way of doing his work of my more or less natural view of this canoe and the sunrise behind them.
I've devoted most of my work recently to just totally non-objective stuff.
The range of style is very difficult to pinpoint. It has a calligraphic quality. He loves text, but he moves that beyond the letter form to a simplified, beautiful abstract form on a variety of different levels, whether it be a print in enamel work, whether it be a huge monumental aluminum sculpture.
His abstract sculpture somehow has a flow and a rhythm and a spirit to it. Not only wit, but vivacity and energy. No work of art is effective if it isn't full of energy.
I think he would have, if he'd have moved to Seattle or San Francisco, I think he'd have been a giant. I really do. I don't know anybody, and I know a lot of artists that are well known that can even compare to Harold and how much he can produce, and as well as he can do it.
I've always wondered if Harold had been in New York with David Smith or some of the other noted monumental sculptors, what would have happened as far as a broader, more universal knowledge of Harold's work.
And underlying the whole damn thing, which I just resent to beat hell, is will somebody buy it? You know?
So down deep, I think he always kind of wanted more recognition in a way. But I don't think he's willing to play the games that are necessary to do that.
With Harold being in Spokane, I think it's an advantage for him in that he can remain true to what he does.
I've rewritten it, but the passionate tell us to sing, but and the zealots insist on choosing the songs. Now I've refined it to say the passionate exhort us to sing.
Harold has something to say about everything there is.
The notion that as soon as we make a mark on something, that mark has to represent something else, I do not understand. And if you go gunk on the piano, what is that? It's gunk. That's all it is gunk. And if you put it together with gink, gink, gunk, 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 you got something. And I feel the same way about drawing lines. Why in the hell does that line have to represent something? I just don't, to me that makes no sense at all. The creative process is still that place where we're drawn to the unknown, where we are not put off by differences in things. We rejoice in them. My favorite still is very few people care anything about art, and when they do, it's because they've confused it with something else. That is so profound. You know? I really beginning to worry about myself.